What does this variety of airplanes have in common? Well, they're all fun to fly, they're all airplanes you'd be proud to own, and they're all taildraggers. Now, being able to fly a taildragger may open the door to purchasing an inexpensive first airplane, such as a Cessna 140, an Aeronca Champ, a Tailorcraft, a Citabria, or a Piper Cub, which, by the way, is now back in production. Being a proficient taildragger pilot opens the door to flying some of the most fun and exciting airplanes around, like these antiques, warbirds, biplanes, home builds, and military trainers like this T6, which we'll check out later in this issue. And being proficient in a taildragger, like this Aeronca Champ, can open the door to backwoods places where nose-wheel aircraft just shouldn't go. Pilots joke that you're not through flying a taildragger until the engine is shut down and the wheels are chocked. And with good reason. They're more demanding of piloting skill and less forgiving of mistakes. But as any bush pilot can tell you, taildraggers offer significant advantages over tricycle gear airplanes. Because the tail sits so low, taildraggers offer better ground clearance for propellers. Here, for example, it's 21 inches. Now, this lessens the chance of damage to a propeller when operating on unprepared strips. Now, if this airplane was a trike, it would have a prop clearance of 10 inches. Now, that's 11 inches less than the taildragger. Hey, thanks a lot, Dan. On the takeoff roll, the tail wheel can be lifted quite early, and the wing can be set at the maximum lifting angle, poising the airplane for flight very early in the game. A nose wheel can't be raised until the airplane reaches a higher speed, and the nose wheel, bouncing along the terrain, is an impediment to acceleration. Besides which, in really rough or soft fields, the nose wheel can dig in and be damaged. Another advantage of a taildragger is that it can take off in a shorter distance and at a slightly lower airspeed than an equivalent tricycle design. Now, here's why. As a tricycle gear airplane rotates for takeoff, the horizontal tail surface produces a downward force to raise the nose wheel. This negative lift effectively adds weight to the airplane and requires that the wing produce additional lift for takeoff. But now look at the taildragger. The horizontal tail surfaces produce positive lift to raise the tail. Since the tail feathers are supporting some aircraft weight, the wing doesn't have to produce as much additional lift to get the airplane off the ground. And once you're in the air, the tail wheel still provides a couple of advantages. First of all, it's lighter than a nose wheel, so you get a bit more useful load. And it's a lot smaller than a nose wheel, which means less drag and higher cruise speed. For example, this Piper Pacer, the one with a tail wheel, and this Piper Tri-Pacer, the one with a nose wheel, are virtually identical airplanes, except for the landing gear. Now, in this particular case, the Pacer, the one with a tail wheel, is 8 knots faster. But flying a taildragger is not all honey and cream. There are some very serious disadvantages, and these relate to directional control difficulties and instability while maneuvering on the ground. The first problem is that the taildragger is a natural weather vane. It's built just like one, and seemingly with a mind of its own, a taildragger has a tendency to turn into the wind, no matter which way it's coming from. Turning into the wind is no problem at all. As you can see, the airplane wants to do that all by itself. But since the airplane wants to turn into the wind, turning downwind can be very difficult, or even impossible if the wind is strong enough. Turning away from the wind can require full rudder, hefty differential braking, and a heavy hand on the throttle to blow air across the rudder and increase its effectiveness. Weather vaning is only one reason why it is difficult to keep a taildragger's nose pointed in the right direction. The second has to do with the location of the center of gravity, which, on a taildragger, is located behind the main landing gear, thankfully. Because if the CG were located ahead of the main landing gear, the airplane would simply plop on its nose while sitting on the ground. When a tail dragger starts to turn, the momentum or inertia of the airplane wants to make it keep going straight. It's one of Newton's laws at work. In other words, the center of gravity, or the weight of the airplane itself, tends to continue the turn by pushing against the outside main landing gear wheel. In this respect, the tail dragger is unstable. Now, once a turn on the ground has begun, for any reason, the aircraft tends to continue turning and turning and turning. And if a pilot doesn't maintain control, the result is a ground loop. Now, how would you like to see a demonstration of a ground loop? Now, I know you really didn't expect me to ground loop an airplane, but we can accomplish the same thing using this tricycle. First of all, let's demonstrate how a nose wheel works. The center of gravity is behind the nose wheel. Now, notice how the tricycle, more or less, wants to go in a straight line. Okay, now let's turn the tricycle around and convert it into a tail dragger. Notice now that the center of gravity is situated behind the main landing gear. Now let's see what happens when we push it. Well, there's the ground loop I promised you. Only quick feed on the rudder pedals can keep a tail dragger going where you want it to go. And this alert, quick reaction is one of the principal skills that a pilot must learn when transitioning to a tail dragger. Another problem you might encounter while taxiing some tail draggers is over-the-nose visibility. The solution is to make gentle S-turns. This allows you to alternately look ahead from one side of the aircraft and then the other. And remember, always taxi slowly in a tail dragger and be alert.
Okay, we're going to make a normal tail dragger takeoff. One thing you have to remember is that because the tail is so low and the nose so high, P factor is effective almost immediately, so it takes a little bit of right rudder as soon as you add power to keep the airplane going straight. The idea, of course, is to raise the tail early in the takeoff roll to reduce the drag on the airplane. Keep the airplane going straight ahead, work your feet hard. When you have liftoff speed, simply raise the nose and begin a normal climb. There really isn't all that much to it. It's a matter of keeping active on the rudder pedals, keeping alert, keeping the airplane going straight ahead. Once in the air, there's no significant difference between a tail dragger and a nose wheel airplane. The only difference really is ground handling, takeoffs, landings, maneuvering on the ground. Okay, we're now going to make a crosswind takeoff. The wind is coming from the right. In a crosswind takeoff in a tail dragger, really combines the normal technique used for taking off in a tail dragger with the crosswind technique normally used in a nose wheel type airplane. Pull the control stick to the right because the wind is coming from the right. Raise the tail, keep the airplane going straight, right wing down, lift off speed, and there we go. Once you're in the air, of course, the tail dragger is just like any other airplane. Use coordinated controls and make a normal climb out. The soft field takeoff in a tail dragger is similar again to a soft field takeoff made in a tricycle gear airplane. The only difference, of course, in a tricycle gear airplane, you have to raise the nose and lower the tail to increase the angle of attack so that the airplane will come off the ground at as early a speed as possible without allowing the nose wheel to burrow into the ground. In a tail dragger, you're already in the ideal liftoff attitude for a soft field takeoff, so all we're going to do is roll down the runway, keep the tail on the ground, and when the airplane is ready to fly, it'll come off the ground in that attitude. Here we go. We never raise the tail as we do during a normal takeoff. We simply allow the airplane to fly off the ground in three-point attitude. A common mistake made by pilots transitioning to tail draggers is to raise the tail too high, to lower the nose too much during a takeoff in a tail dragger. I'm going to demonstrate that. I'm going to force the nose way down, and of course, this keeps the airplane on the ground. It can't possibly come up. If you do it too much, there's always the danger of pushing the prop into the ground. That's no good. You can wear out the tires, and you'll never get off the ground unless you, pull it off.
Remember, when you make a takeoff in a tail dragger, you should put the airplane into a level attitude or slightly tail low. When you put the nose down, you're setting the wings at a negative angle of attack. They can't possibly produce enough lift to get the airplane off the ground.
Okay, we're turning on to about a 1/2 mile final approach. And let's bear in mind that while the airplane is in the air, once again, it flies just like an airplane with a nose wheel does. The only difference occurs once the airplane touches down. So the flare for landing in a tail dragger is very much the same as the flare for a landing in a nose wheel equipped airplane. The only difference is we want to make awfully certain that we don't allow the airplane to touch down until it's in a 3-point attitude. Getting the airplane in that attitude is exactly the same as flaring a nose wheel equipped airplane into a full stall landing. So in a way, all we have to do is pretend that we're in a nose wheel equipped airplane and we're going to make a full stall landing. We're going to hold the airplane off as long as is possible. Hold it off, 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 and there we go. The airplane lands in 3-point attitude. Of course, once the airplane's on the ground, we have to keep our feet alive, make sure we keep the airplane going straight ahead. It's not as easy to maintain directional control in a tail dragger as it is in a nose wheel equipped airplane.
The most common mistake when landing a tail dragger is to let the main gear touch first, which, because of the CG location, can induce a big bounce. And here's why. If the main wheels are allowed to touch prematurely, the momentum of the airplane, acting through the center of gravity, will force the tail down and simultaneously increase the angle of attack of the wing. Now, this added lift causes an involuntary liftoff, a bounce. When flying with a nose wheel, just the opposite occurs. The main wheels punch into the concrete during a less than perfect landing. The center of gravity, which is ahead of the main landing gear, forces the nose wheel down, and this decreases the angle of attack, which is another reason why the tricycle landing gear is so much more tolerant of sloppy technique. The secret to a good 3-point landing is to touch down without drifting. This preserves directional control, and in a 3-point full stall attitude to prevent bouncing.
We're turning onto a 1/2 mile final approach. We're going to make a wheel landing, which may sound kind of strange because all landings made in land planes, hopefully, are made on their wheels. But of course, in a tail dragger, a wheel landing means that you're going to land only on the main gear tires. With the airplane in a relatively level attitude, the tail will be off the ground. The wheel landing is well suited for landing in crosswinds and gusty air because you'll land with slightly more airspeed, slightly more controllability. So you approach the ground when you get very, very close, pull the power off, pull the airplane in a level attitude just a few inches above the runway, and allow the wheels to roll on. And they will if you've done it properly. It takes a little practice. You don't need to shove the stick forward to put the airplane on the ground. It'll settle all by itself, but you might apply a little forward pressure to prevent the airplane from going back into the air. The tail comes down. Maintain directional control as you would during any landing in a tail dragger.
A common fear of students is that the prop will hit the runway when you apply forward pressure to keep the aircraft on the ground after making a wheel landing. But there's more clearance than you might think, and the fear is generally unfounded. The key to a good wheel landing is flying the wheels gently onto the runway and adding the necessary forward pressure to keep the airplane from bouncing back into the air. Another advantage of a tail dragger is that they can maneuver tightly in cramped quarters. Although you can pivot a tail dragger on a main wheel, this is not recommended because you can wear a spot in the tire. Tight turns are made by allowing the inside wheel to turn just slightly. Flying a tail dragger is more difficult than flying with a nose wheel. It demands proper handling all the time and is less tolerant of error. But learning to fly a tail dragger challenges a pilot to fly attentively and precisely, which are wonderful attributes for any of us who envision ourselves as proficient pilots. And let me add, flying a tail dragger well is very gratifying and a lot of fun.